Hi, I'm Lili, and today I'm going to show you how I made this whimsical living room that I've used in my last stop motion animation. If you haven't seen the short film, I'm going to put a link above and in the description below. So this week I'm going to show you how I made the living room, and next time I'm going to show you how I made the whole street that is connected to that room. I'm going to show you first how I made the main structure, then the curved wooden floor. Then I'm going to show you how I made the tree with the bird cages, the couch nest, the little stove with the fire effects, the staircase, and plenty of little props to go with it. Enjoy the video! First, I've cut some 18mm plywood for the base. If you have 12mm, that's absolutely fine. I also cut some studs. Then I placed my piece of plywood on top of the studs. Drill into it to connect the two together, use a countersink drill bit and screw them together. Then I start working on the walls with 9mm plywood and cut the windows out. Then I've decided to have two walls fixed to the base. I glue the two walls together and use a nail gun to hold in place. I've also cut the third and fourth wall, but I didn't need them right now, so I just put them on the side. So now if you wonder why I have a third and fourth wall, is to give me a bit more flexibility with the set. When I'm shooting a scene like the opening one, I needed to be able to close the room near the door. And here is another example when I need to shoot from the main room, and then I need to have this other wall with the window near the staircase to be able to close the room. I went back to my first and second wall and drill them into the studs and screw them together. I've also cut a little piece of balsa wood to create a door frame and window frame. Now I'm going to talk about the curved wooden floor. I had some leftover oak that I cut to the length of my living room and start drawing some nice curve onto it. Then I used a jigsaw to separate each pieces. Make sure you have a precision blade to have a nice clean cut. I used a Dremel to smooth the edges and also a detail sander to make sure I have a nice smooth surface. Then I've applied a thick coat of PVA and placed each pieces one by one carefully. I've used Danish oil because that's what I had on hand that day. I start priming the walls, then apply 2 coats of white paint and just apply different colors with a sponge to create a bit of texture on the wall. Then I've sealed the wall with clear matte varnish to protect them. Now I'm going to talk about the tree and the bird cages. I wanted to make the tree out of Fimo, so it needs to be cooked. I needed to create a structure that I can actually put into the oven with the tree to make sure it's not going to lose its shape. I knew I had to create a structure with proper timber. I had some oak left over. Don't use some plywood because it's got some glue. So if you put some plywood into the oven, with the heat it will release some fumes, so try to avoid it. So I've cut a piece of oak to create the chimney breast, use a little Dremel to smooth the edges, and then start to assemble some leftover piece of oak to create the whole structure. And this is how it looks when it's just screwed together. It doesn't need to be pretty, but it just needs to be assembled in a way that it holds together. Then I start creating a base for the tree with some aluminium foil and some wire. Then I've covered everything with some brown Fimo and start shaping it. The good thing about working on a base like this is I can take the tree out to smooth the branch from behind, for example, but I can also take the whole structure and place it in the living room set, and I can see exactly how it's going to look together. Are the proportions right? Is it sticking out too much, or do I need to change the shape of the branches? Then I start working on the texture. It was a mix of sculpting tools. I like to use sponges which have dry paint in it because it presses a nice texture into the bark. Add as many details as you can. And this is how it looked before I coat it. I place the whole thing into the oven and cook it for half an hour. Then I start applying some acrylic paint in different shades with a sponge. I've applied some diluted brown paint and remove the excess to create a dirty wash. And then I've applied some dry brushing. Then I've primed the chimney breast. I've also cut some pieces of balsa wood and primed them as well for skirting. Then apply 2 coats of acrylic paint on the chimney breast and skirting. Once all of that was dry, I used my glue gun and attached the chimney breast in place. I've created a little earth with some balsa wood and just covered it black paint. And I used the hot glue gun to glue it in place. Then I've hot glued the tree in place. Then I've added the skirting. They're brilliant to hide all the transition between the walls and the floor. And don't forget to do the same for the third and fourth wall. Now I'm going to talk about the bird cages. This material I enjoy using a lot is Worbla. It's a thermoplastic, and I'm going to use the 3 kinds of thermoplastic in this video, for example. So you've got the classic type, then the smoother black version, and then the transparent version. For the bird cages, I've used the transparent version. You can heat it with a heat gun and shape it around anything, and that is just magical. So for example, the first bird cages you can see, I've simply stretched the thermoplastic around a pen. The other one, the black bird cages, is actually a permanent marker. But the one tool that was the best to create the bird cages shape was actually my plumbing tool, water pump pliers in particular. Who would have thought, but the handles were just the perfect shape. So the way I've done it, I've cut a piece of the clear Worbla, hit it with a heat gun, and once it was soft, I've stretched it onto the handle. So be careful when you're working with Worbla because it's boiling hot. It will be best to use some gloves, but I don't have the same grip to the plastic. So for me, I work bare hand, and I stretch it around the handle, then hold it in place. Once it's cooled down, I can take it out of the handle, cut the excess, and I've got my little shape. Now to be able to build the bird cages, I need to close the bottom. For that I use some baking paper, apply a little bit of hot glue on it, my dome on top of that, and once the glue has cooled down, it comes out of the paper very easily, and you can just trim the edges with a scissor. I need a structure to be able to hold the bird cage in place so I can add the little detail, and for that I use a piece of timber with 2 brackets on each side, use a long screw throughout to hold the bird cage in place. Then I apply some puff paint, which is called 3D paint, relief paint, or whatever. Take your time to apply it carefully, to follow whatever design you fancy, and let it dry overnight. In the meantime, I drill a hole into my chimney breast to be able to bring some micro LEDs from behind the wall. Sorry for the pictures being completely out of focus, but this happened. I was able to insert probably 5 meters of micro LEDs from behind the wall. I've cut the top of the little cages and insert 4 or 5 micro LEDs inside each cage, and then use the wire to hold the cage in place and try to follow the shape of the branch. Initially I was trying to hold the wire in place with some tiny piece of duct tape. It didn't hold enough, so I ended up going back to it with the hot glue gun, and it looks a bit better. I even added a little bit of brown acrylic paint just to hide the wire and to blend it even more. Now for the windows, I've used some white craft foam and some transparent plastic from old packaging. I've cut the foam into the right size, used some super glue to glue it to the piece of plastic. Once it was dry, I cut it to size, place it into the window opening, and use some clear tape to hold it in place. I did the same for the other window. To make the curtains, I've used 2 different types simply because I didn't have enough of the one with the pattern to do both the front and the back of the curtains. I've sewed a piece of fabric together. And then inside of the fabric, I've used a thin wire mesh which allow the fabric to be shaped in any direction you want. So you can actually shape it and sculpt it and it will stay in place. Once the wire mesh was inside, I can just fold the fabric on the top part and sew it together to close it. Then I can start shaping the curtains. As you can see, it holds the fold really nicely. For the curtain pole, I've used some wooden stick and apply a little bit of diluted paint to color it. Then I've made a hole at the top of my curtains, large enough to fit my wooden pole. I've drilled some hole above the windows and pressed some wire into it. I bended the wire upwards, and then I was able to place the curtain pole onto it. I've cut the excess and bend it backwards. Now I'm going to talk about the catch nest. For the base, I've used a piece of basswood that I cut and sanded till I had a nice shape and cover with some diluted brown acrylic paint. Then I've used a piece of polystyrene, cut it to shape, sand it down until I had a nice oval shape. I've also cut some tiny pillows out of leftover packaging material. I've copied my oval shape onto a piece of fabric, twice, sew it together, turn it upside down, and then I place the polystyrene shape inside of it. And I close it by hand. Then I've done the same for the pillows. I've copied each of the pillow onto fabric twice, sew it together, and there you go. Now that the base was dry, I used a hot glue gun to be able to attach the top pillow onto it. Now to protect the white fabric, I've covered it with some aluminium foil, and I've used some branches that I found in the garden and a hot glue gun to attach the branches one by one onto the base. I kept building it up until I was happy with the overall shape. Then I cleaned my hands, removed the aluminium foil, and there you go. I just had to place my little pillow onto it. Isn't that cute? Now I'm going to talk about the staircase. Initially, I made a mock-up with some cardboard and a piece of plastic to get an idea of the right size and proportion for it. Then I've copied each steps into a piece of balsa wood. I think it was probably 5mm thick or something like that. I've sanded it down to make sure I have some really nice smooth edges and drill a hole in the center of it. Then I place them all on a piece of wire, 5mm thick. I've applied some diluted brown paint. And I used some tape. Initially it was electric tape, but that didn't hold enough, so I used duct tape later on to replace them. Then I needed to create a template. Then I've used a piece of paper that I've taped in place. I was able to mark each step and their position with a pencil and also create an overall shape of what my banister will look like. Then I start creating a nice design with some organic shape. When I was happy with it, I used an X-Acto knife to cut it out. This is what my template looked like. Then I've copied it onto a piece of Worbla, the classic version of Worbla this time, and use a scissor and X-Acto knife to cut it out. I made some holes at the base of my banister to be able to attach it. Then I've copied each hole onto the steps, use my drill very carefully to drill into it. Then I've used the tiniest nail I can find in my workshop to attach it together. And this is what it looked like all assembled. Then I just had to drill into the base and be able to place my staircase onto it. That means I also can remove it if suddenly I have to shoot it from that angle with my camera and the staircase was in the way. Now I'm going to talk about the little stove. Initially I made a drawing up to scale, and I was lucky enough to have some tiny little hinges that were the perfect size for that project. I built up the base with some cardboard and a hot glue gun. Then I used some black Worbla to cover the inside of the stove. I've cut a bigger piece of Worbla, heat up with the heat gun, and then apply on the front and sides of my stove and start pressing it with my finger for it to take the shape of a piece. Then I carefully use an X-Acto knife to cut the excess, and this is what it looked like. Then I've cut some small piece of Worbla, pressed them onto a piece of card. And the great thing with Worbla is that it will stick to itself. You can stretch it, fold it. You can press some tools or texture into it and it will hold its shape. So with a ruler, for example, you can create a really nice detail. Now because the Worbla stick to itself, you can just warm up the base, warm up the top, and then it will attach and stick together. And so we look with the top and base. Then I start working on the feet by drawing them on a little strip of Worbla. At that time, I've tried to fit my stove into the chimney breast opening and realized actually it was too tall. So I had to cut it down significantly, and this is how it looks when it's altered to fit. So then I went back to my feet. I was able to use the hot glue gun to glue them together and then glue them in place. Use the hot glue gun inside because you will never see that part, so it doesn't matter. For the door, I've used the clear Worbla and the black Worbla. I've used some super glue to attach the hinges and also to attach the glass. What I didn't realize that the super glue got into the hinges, and from that point onward it was really hard to have them actually moving. I cut some opening into the base of my stove to be able to slide the hinges into it. I've heated a little bit of Worbla and shaped it around my sculpting tools to create a flue and use some hot glue gun to hold it in place. I drill a hole in the door to be able to attach a piece of wire with some super glue. I've also drilled a big opening at the back. I should have done this way earlier, but anyway. For the flame, I've used the clear Worbla. I've cut some rough flame of different shape and sizes. Then I've used the heat gun to be able to sculpt them into something a bit more dynamic. Then I've applied some orange and red acrylic paint and let it dry completely. In the meantime, I did some little logs with some Fimo that I cut into different lengths and applied some nice texture to it. This is what my logs look like. And then I cooked them for 15 minutes. Then I've just dry brushed them with some beige acrylic paint to highlight the texture. Then I went back to my stove. I've been able to place some micro LED from behind the wall into the stove, and I've placed my logs in position. Once I find the right log for the stove, I test it in place and then use some hot glue gun to make sure it stays in that position. When it comes to shooting the stop motion animation, I had to repeat the same system. So I removed the whole door, then I removed the flame, take another flame, put it back in, and then put back the door and move the head slightly. Take a picture and repeat the whole thing again. Probably done this like 70 or 80 times. It was time consuming, but it looks cool. Now I'm going to talk about the little shelf units. I've made a mock-up with some cardboard. When I was happy with it, I separate each component and copy them on a piece of balsa wood. Cut them, sand them down until I have all my pieces. Then I attach everything together. Hot glue the top parts onto it and add a bit of acrylic paint. I've used the same system for the table. Mock-up in cardboard, copying them onto balsa wood. Cut them, sand them, attach the feet onto it, place some small strip of balsa wood in between the feet, that makes it more stable. Add a little bit of paint. And then to make sure they hold in place nicely, I've added a little bit of white tack under each feet. When it comes to the painting easel, I've just used some very thin strips of balsa wood and some super glue. To make sure it was straight, I've drawn some lines as reference. And this is how it looks when it's all assembled. Now when it comes to the little basket for the logs, I've used an oval shape at the center, then use the hot glue gun and start pressing each piece all around the basket. Once they hold together nicely, I've added a piece of flat copper wire and hold in place with super glue. Then I've applied some diluted brown paint. Once that was all dry, I was able to fill the center with some hot glue and press all my little logs into it. And there you go. I hope this video was useful to you. Next time I'm going to show you how I made the whole street from scratch, which is connected to that room. Take care.